What if I told you that one of my favourite video game stories of this year wasn't actually written by anyone? It has no script, it has no dialogue, and it's technically not even over yet. That might sound a bit weird if you're not familiar with a little game called Rimworld, which, for those not in the know, is all about surviving a hostile alien wilderness infested by robots, mutants, raiders, and wild animals, all while gradually building up your little colony from a desperate band of scavengers to a thriving civilization. Basically, imagine The Sims, but with slightly more cannibalism. But that isn't why I love the game. See, Rimworld has always billed itself not as a strategy title or as a city builder, even if it is totally those things, but as a story generator. And what may appear to be a slightly grandiose marketing term is actually what makes Rimworld one of the most fascinating games I've ever sunk hundreds of hours into. And to explain why, I'm going to need to tell you the tragic tale of Gerbear. Gerbear, yes, that's the name the game gave him, just roll with it, was one of 3 unlucky victims of a crashed spaceship alongside Agent, the crackshot builder, and Cottonwood, the farming savant. But unlike them, Gerbear wasn't really good at anything besides talking, and so he gradually found his role of leader of the colony and was responsible for giving speeches and converting prisoners. Gerbear enjoyed his position for a time, but with it came hardship. After the colony took in a wandering child from the wilderness, who was instantly, and I mean instantly, devoured by a wild kitsune, which was added by one of the many mods I have installed, the decision was made that the colony would never fail someone in need again. And that's where the problem started. Enter Lorena, another runaway child who, unlike the unfortunately delicious Mo, had a suite of powerful vampiric abilities, was incredibly smart, great in a fight, and crucially, was even more charismatic than Gerbear. Quickly, Lorena rose up the ranks, leading the colony in a battle against a horde of flesh beasts, using her big brain to begin a technological golden age, and eventually supplanting Gerbear as leader because everyone liked her more and she was much better at throwing parties, much to Gerbear's chagrin. Under Lorena's leadership, the colony began to change. Vampires became worshipped, boosting overall happiness, but resulting in one of Gerbear's closest friends getting eaten by a vampire guest the colony took in. Useless colonists started to be executed and then devoured by Lorena to fuel her powerful abilities, and getting advanced tech meant fighting dangerous mechanoids to secure special parts, leading to Cottonwood, then Gerbear's wife, getting shot through the skull and dying instantly. This was the start of a downward spiral for Gerbear, and the more he lashed out, the more his former friends started to resent him, until eventually, after one tantrum too many, he was arrested in the very prison he helped build. Gerbear, betrayed by his friends, bided his time in prison until the colony was distracted by a zombie attack before staging a daring breakout attempt. But who was waiting for him right outside the door? Yes, that's right, Lorena, who chased him into the comms room, gouged out Gerbear's eye and tore off his leg before dragging him back to his cell. Near death, useless and entirely unloved, all that remained was for Gerbear to be dragged in front of his former friends and executed to give them all a mood buff. And in the end, all his former comrade and last remaining member of the original trio Agent had to say was that he was glad Gerbear was dead. Everything I just said, the vampire cult takeover, the almost Shakespearean fall from grace story, the poetic symmetry of Gerbear's final end, nobody wrote that. Rimworld's epics of survival against the odds, and its many tragic tales that mostly involve me overestimating my society's ability to fight a bunch of megaspiders, spring entirely from the game's systems bouncing off each other and me making entirely rational strategic choices in response. And yet, from these simple interactions, an entire story springs up. How? The name for this kind of narrative design, where plots don't exist beforehand thanks to an author, but emerge organically from the player's decisions and a game's systems smashing together like particles in a super collider, is emergent storytelling. And far from being a little novelty exclusive to just a handful of games, I think this design principle is fast becoming a bold new frontier, with the few games just starting to scratch the surface of what emergent storytelling is capable of already giving us some incredible results. I'll never forget the time that I united Spain a few centuries too early in Crusader Kings by alternately sleeping with or murdering, sometimes both, anyone who got in my way. Or when my lethal company team thought that we were smarter than a gun turret and accidentally ended up with us sacrificing ourselves to it like a bunch of idiots. Or when I met an orc in Shadow of War that just would not die and kept reappearing over and over and over and over again. These are some of my favourite stories that came out of my time with these various games, often much more so than their actual storylines. And I think a large part of their appeal is that emergent narratives put the players in the driver's seat for a change. We're the ones telling the story, and the designers are there to facilitate our narrative rather than the other way around. The thing is though, is that while emergent storytelling is fascinating and soon to be incredibly important, it's still very much in its infancy and pretty tricky to get right. For every game that attempts to create a foundation from which organic storytelling can spring to life, most fail to ever reach the dizzy heights of the emergent narrative greats, and quite a few fail to generate anything that looks like a story at all. The reason why is because whilst emergent narratives do seem like they magically come from nowhere, the reality is that unlike books or movies or TV or my erotic Sephiroth x Waluigi enemies to lovers fanfic, they come from us. Without a player to mentally assemble the random outputs of video game systems into something resembling a story, and without someone to care about what's happening, an emergent narrative can never emerge. And so, in the absence of an author writing things in advance, emergent narrative games need to instead encourage and empower the player to take on that mantle and create a story for themselves. And in order to achieve this, games first need to lay down a few key pieces of design foundation. Take for example the issue of providing players with inspiration and events that we can use to create a story. What makes a particular detail or series of events worth being the centerpiece of an emergent adventure? How can you know when something is going to be the start of a fun narrative? The short answer is, you can't. It's not like Gerber had a prone to dramatic irony trait, and there wasn't some sort of ominous musical sting when Lorella turned up. No individual component of an emergent narrative is going to be inherently interesting. What makes them interesting is in how they interact with other components of the story and how their consequences manifest. I think a great, obvious example of this can be seen, weirdly enough, in the Far Cry games. Wow, a nice thing about a Ubisoft game, who'd have guessed? Because the enemy AI, cars, animals, fire propagation systems, and your own actions interact at so many different points, you're almost always going to end up with these fun, chaotic adventures that no one can predict when these systems collide. A stray shot might free an animal which attacks friends and foes alike, fire causes explosions which in turn causes even more collateral damage, and random enemy convoys turn up midway through missions to add fuel to the fire, sometimes literally, creating a fun, chaotic series of events in the process. This also happens in similarly simulation-y games like the new Zeldas. Systemic reactions cascade into each other, forcing you to make decisions which in turn create more reactions, forming a coherent narrative, like that time I thought what would be a magnificent battle wagon blew up in my face, or the time I was caught somewhere cold without warm clothes, and so I had to set a bunch of wolves on fire to survive. You know how it is. That's not the limit of connecting systems together to tell emergent stories though. This sort of design is also possible over larger scopes and longer timeframes. The obvious example of doing this well comes in the form of the Shadow of Mordor series. Each of the game's individual orcs have their own personality, traits, weaknesses, etc., but this isn't what makes them such fantastic subjects for an emergent story. It's instead how they change in response to your actions. Some of them might gain new fears based on how you beat them, they might develop friendships and avenge their buddy's death, or they might even learn from your previous engagements, developing new skills, quickly establishing them as something more than a regular enemy. When you also factor in that regular orcs that kill you get promoted to named nemesis, and that high-level orcs you've interacted with a lot are much more likely to cheat death, the game quickly assembles this recurring cast of characters you get to have fun seeing again and again. It's great. On the flip side, when games, even ones with a lot of emergent storytelling potential, fail to properly connect up ideas, they can lose any sort of narrative cohesion. Shadows of Doubt, for example, is a very technically impressive noir detective game with procedurally generated cases which are great fun to solve, but they make for surprisingly bad emergent stories because all the systems and random elements never really connect to each other. I broke into this lady's house to ask where her wife was, and she got so angry that she chased me out of a window. But when I came back, she didn't so much as remember me, and was still giving the same bland, civil responses about the fact that her wife likes hanging out at the wine shop, which, if you ask me, is a red flag, but I'm not gonna judge. Games don't even necessarily need to imply a narrative connection in order to create the inspiration for a fun emergent story. Often all that's needed is a strong series of mechanical consequences that we can get invested in enough to tie them into a wider narrative. Look at my sweet baby XCOM 2 for example. You are mechanically encouraged to get attached to your various troops because they each serve crucial roles in your squad, and losing one is a big deal, making their unlikely triumphs feel even better, and their deaths, as well as the persistent injuries and conditions they obtain, which often relate directly to a specific source, all the more harrowing. Conversely, in, say, Darkest Dungeon, not only are you discouraged from giving a shit about your sacrificial goons because kicking them out when they get too crazy is strictly optimal, but your in-game choices have almost zero bearing on which quirks and relationships your heroes develop, so you never really feel like caring about them is worth your while, and it's that much harder to build stories around them. Why is this lady hopeless now? Why do these characters fancy each other now? Who knows, beats me, has literally nothing to do with my actions. This area in particular is something Rimworld really excels at when it comes to children from its biotech expansion. Children represent a huge cost in food and time because they're an extra mouth to feed and pregnant women can't work as well. And children are also a huge liability because everyone gets sad when babies are sad, and as my story earlier showed, nobody likes a dead kid. However, they're also incredibly valuable investments, as kids can do odd jobs that no one else wants to do, they're much more likely to have good stats and traits than converted prisoners or wanderers, and happy children make all the adults happy. What this means is that kids are these huge risk-reward opportunities that you're inherently invested in keeping alive and happy, making protecting them an incredibly easy narrative centerpiece because so much of the colony's prosperity already depends on them. A large part of what makes it so easy to string together events into a cohesive narrative, however, comes not from the anecdotes themselves, but the overall rhythm of the game, and how conducive it is to storytelling on a structural level. If events in games play out in distinct beginnings, middles, and ends, even if they overlap, it's that much easier to mentally think about Emergent events as being part of a nice contained narrative unit. And without these structural guideposts, it's difficult for us to contain Emergent narratives in our head all at once. Look at the difference between, say, Crusader Kings and Civilization. They're both historical 4X games with a lot of the same theming, a lot of the same gameplay ideas, and even some shared characters, but Crusader Kings games lend themselves much more easily to Emergent storytelling, with practically everyone who's ever played the game having some sort of tale of incestuous satanic murder to tell. This is because where Civilization is all about exponential growth with new mechanics constantly being layered on top of old ones, and the game centering around ageless, quasi-allegorical super beings, Crusader Kings tracks a much more organic ebb and flow of growth and decay. On a character level, you start out weak, gain strengths, and build relationships as you age, before gradually transitioning into maintaining and securing your holdings for the next generation as you get older and weaker, making each character and each dynasty into a series of contained stories bookended by life and death. The same also applies to empires themselves. They have several forces that ensure they grow and then break apart several times, meaning that the world is constantly changing in unpredictable ways, but always in familiar, narratively sensible patterns. The importance of baking a dramatic arc into the systems of a game is also evident in more action-centric titles. Compare the superficially similar games, Left 4 Dead and Deep Rock Galactic, with their contemporaries, Back 4 Blood and Darktide. They're all games about killing things that are analogous to zombies with some degree of systemic pacing and spawning mechanic, but only the former two games have managed to give me those epic Emergent stories of that time we all got killed by a charger, or that time we braved a sandstorm to escape at the last second. Why is this? Well, it all comes down to structure. Left 4 Dead's AI director and Deep Rock swarms react to the player's performance and create peaks and troughs in the monster's activity to create the sort of narrative arcs we can build an Emergent story around. Things start relatively peaceful with there just being regular baddies milling around, then you begin to see the telltale signs of a swarm on the horizon, and before you know it you're in a pitched battle fighting to survive before things die down again and you have to deal with the consequences. This rising falling structure isn't particularly sophisticated, but it serves as a narrative foundation that adds context to the environments, random events, and player dynamics that serve as the story's actual substance. Conversely, the other two games I mentioned I found just have this sort of conveyor belt of zombies attacking you all the time, making it difficult to tell a player-led story because there's no distinction between mindlessly chopping and blasting through a textureless sea of zombies in one area and doing the same elsewhere. Without time to explore and take a breather, the big narrative moments just blur into everything else. The key to creating a scaffolding that players can build an Emergent story around is as much about creating lulls as it is spikes of interesting systemic interaction. Downtime lets us consolidate our focus on the parts of the story we're most interested in, and also provides a point of contrast for when things get nuts. Lethal Company and Content Warning do this excellently. If the whole game were deadly monster encounters, then they'd just be complete madness, but the fact that both games start with the players being safe and together, before gradually ramping up the threat as people get split up, communication becomes harder, and chaos takes hold, before returning to that safe baseline, is what makes the escalation into horror comedy chaos so compelling. The same principle applies to, say, GTA's Wanted system, where stories naturally escalate into epic chases or doomed final stands against the cops as you commit to ever more crimes in the process of escaping, rather than the game just dumping the entire police force on you at once for something as small as ramming your car into a few measly pedestrians. Rimworld also obeys a similar structural conceit behind the scenes, and it's a large part of why the game works so well as a narrative engine. The default settings will push the colony hard with raids and disasters before easing back for a few days, giving you a chance to rest, recover, and plan. Without this downtime, the dramatic peaks of your story wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting, and you wouldn't have time to get used to the characters because they'd be getting chopped to bits by mechanoids constantly, leading to a less well-paced Emergent story with characters that you care less about. Unfortunately, Giving players a story scaffold to work with, and lots of fun, interconnected inspiration for emergent narratives can only get a game so far. If us players aren't motivated to actually put in the work, take on the role of storyteller, and make an emergent narrative for ourselves, then it's never gonna happen. And so games also need to encourage us to care about what's happening, and to think about our actions in more of a roleplay context. This is why Baldur's Gate 3, for example, gives you an inspiration point and a bit of XP, or just straight up easier difficulty checks, for doing things related to your background or class. If you have an incentive to roleplay as, say, a barbarian, then you're much more likely to make consistent narrative choices, leading to a better story. In short, the best emergent narrative games give players an incentive to create a consistent narrative persona, whether it's a single character, or a colony, or a whole empire, but leave the specifics up to them, and allow the player to embellish these systemic broad strokes into their own personal narrative. Like how the excellent Wildermyth uses events not to tell you what your character's personalities are, but to set up interesting circumstances that let you decide who they are for yourself, which is much more fun. For a bigger picture version of the same ideas, you need only look at Stellaris, where your choice of government and background each provide a few big fun options that help you define your empire, like how my psychic xenophobes get to call everyone heretics, and they get some special options relating to purging inferior species. However, most of the game is left pretty open, giving me space to figure out what sort of thing my bird boys would be most likely to do, which is much more fulfilling than simply being told what a xenophobic or spiritualist empire is allowed to do. In my case, I decided to worship a series of eldritch super beings because the one thing that the birds valued more than racism was having an extra-dimensional sugar daddy. These ideas were really pioneered in The Sims, arguably the original emergent narrative game, where particular personality types get unique options and moodlets that define how they act, but the game is deliberately vague as to the specifics of what they're actually doing, thanks to the evocative but abstract gestures and the iconic made-up language, letting you project your own unique story onto a handful of canned animations. For the inverse of this idea of incentivizing role-playing through expressive but open prompts, you need only look at Bethesda's games, which kind of suck at giving you opportunities to roleplay because they give you too much freedom and not enough encouragement. Bland, generic choices seem like they give you the most scope for injecting your own character, but with nothing to build from and no way to define your character through their actions, you're left with a blank canvas and nothing to paint with. Ultimately, getting people to care about roleplaying means using narrative and mechanics alike to demonstrate to the players that their choices and their investment in the unfolding story matters. And this is something that's even true in games without emergent narratives that still borrow some of the same principles. The broad plot arcs in, say, the political choose-your-own-adventure game Suzerain were definitely written in advance, but there are so many possible permutations and so many moments where the game calls back to your previous choices that your individual experience and perspective of the story is likely to be completely unique. I rejected this guy's shady backroom corruption deal early on, and the game constantly brought it back up, even once that plot had already played out, colouring all my future interactions with definitely not Elon Musk in a way that had knock-on consequences throughout the game. Equally, my choice to help my wife on her crusade for women's rights made all the right-wing characters hate me, even though most of them weren't directly involved in that storyline. Mass Effect, to cite a AAA example, also loved doing this. That game is even more prescriptivist in where the story can go, but it's also really good at tricking you into thinking like your actions have meaningful consequences by calling back to things you've done earlier in the game, or even in previous entries in the series, giving you an emergent perspective on the story and an organic relationship to the world that feels very rewarding, even if it always comes down to which of the shiny buttons you pick at the end. Now, you might think that these games with pre-written stories shouldn't count as emergent at all because an author has shaped the story in advance, but this sort of involvement from the developer is kind of what I've been arguing for the whole time. Emergent narratives involve much more work from the player, but without the developer's hand to give our actions and choices context, and without them to shape what kind of stories we tell, we may as well just open up a blank Word document and start cracking out a novel. The fun of emergent narratives is different to the fun of making your own story from scratch, and comes from the fact that they grow out of the fertile soil provided to us by the developers and along structured lines that they know are going to lead to the most compelling experience. Any good dungeon master knows this very well. The best emergent tabletop RPG stories come from a synthesis of the dungeon master setting up interesting problems, characters, and surprises in advance, but giving the players wide scope to freely react to and interpret them in a way that creates a story that neither party could have come up with alone. This is why Rimworld's DLCs have all added what feels like quite restrictive new elements, like a bunch of robot bosses to advance through, or a powerful psychic empire to schmooze with, or even a bunch of SCP-style monsters and containment facilities. But what these additions actually provide are a thematic backdrop to encourage role-playing a particular kind of colony and telling a particular kind of story. And nothing exemplifies this better than Ideology's feature edition in the forms of various ideologians. Whether you're a bunch of cannibals, cave dwellers, animal lovers, or stoners, the game is going to provide you a set of restrictions and boundaries that completely shapes how you play, but it all serves to set the stage for your own story rather than leaving you with no direction at all. After all, without the limits imposed by my original colony's forced altruism, I never would have felt obligated to take in a bunch of wanderers, and so my story never would have happened. And that is what emergent narratives are all about. They don't come from nowhere, they emerge from something. And this, I think, is the most important lesson that we have to keep in mind as this kind of storytelling becomes more widespread. While the methodology is different, and you end up with stories that are much more player-driven, emergent narratives are still always going to be born of a cooperation between a developer's direction and a player's imagination. I think particularly in the age of AI, there's a real tendency to think that we could very soon be playing entirely procedural games with truly limitless scope for what kind of emergent narratives could spring forth from our prompts. But as basically every attempt to do just this proves, an emergent narrative not bound by rules, with no mechanics to give your actions a sense of weight, and importantly, no one to set limits on the story and enforce a tone, ends up vague and directionless and completely unable to believably react to your roleplaying, ultimately ending up with a bad story. In all the examples of games with bad emergent narratives that I presented, it's the ones that fail to impose narrative limits and that don't have meaningful consequences that end up suffering. And it's the specificity and vision that can only come from a developer's guiding hand that instead nurtures the very best ones. XCOM knows exactly how brilliantly tense it is when a soldier is clinging to life, so the game adds a bunch of systems that make close calls and near misses more likely than you'd think, making for great emergent war stories. Zekas, the creator of Lethal Company, make communicating with your team clearly way harder than it should be, because not knowing where your allies are or what they can see makes it much more likely that you'll accidentally end up creating some classic horror movie shenanigans. And Rimworld's default scenario gives you a mostly useless pet right at the start, not because it's going to help you or because it's going to teach you something important, but because it's probably going to become either a beloved mascot you'd sacrifice colonists to protect, or it's going to die gruesomely, reminding you of how tough the Rim is, or you're going to have to eat it out of desperation. And that is how good stories get told. So the next time you're playing a game without a hard and fast story and you're relishing the chance to come up with your own, just think for a second that maybe you're not the only author involved. Whatever crazy narrative you're having fun playing out could only exist because whoever made the game handed you the right tools to create it and was confident they'd given you a foundation you cared enough about to build your own unique experience on top of it. Which is why when everything goes wrong, all your guys die and you're looking at the burning remains of a base you spent literally hours on, you can console yourself by saying that you don't suck at Rimworld, you're not terrible at keeping your pawns alive, you were just telling a tragedy the whole time. And when you think about it, that means that I'm actually really good at Rimworld. Yeah, look at that. Whoa, only a really good storyteller could do this. Yeah, whoa, look at that. What a bunch of skill that took. You do believe me, right? Hello, and welcome to this, the After the Video segment. Guess what? I got COVID again, and it wasn't fun. Turns out that it's quite hard to make videos when you can't speak a few words without coughing like a 40-a-day smoker. That's also why my voice sounds extra husky in certain places in this video. Anyway, enough about that. This is where I talk about some cool things and some cool people that I reckon you need to be made aware of. And this time, it's the YouTube channel Filmotter, a video essayist that focuses less on design or aesthetics, but the way games can make us feel and the way they change how we perceive the real world. Otter has got some great videos on the stressful nature of time limits in games, toxic game communities, and a particularly good one about the brilliant En Garde, and how sometimes it's better to accept imperfections and just have fun instead. Filmotter stuff has a great, very personal vibe to it, and I've found on videos where we've covered similar topics that I'm constantly just stunned at all the really clever observations that Otter has spotted that totally passed me by. Seriously, check out their Lovecraftian Games one for proof of what I'm talking about. Otter's videos have amazing production values, and yet they get a criminally low number of views. I highly recommend going and fixing that. Of course, that's not the only cool person I need to shout out. There's also a whole bunch of cool people on the Architect of Games Patreon. Without these people, I would have been forced to push my body past its limit and do myself even more damage when I was sick, but content in the knowledge that my patrons were there to support me, I felt slightly less guilty than I otherwise would have for taking a while off to recover, and I think this video is much better off for me having some extra time to play Rimworld while hopped up on painkillers, because that's how I ended up stumbling into the whole vampire cult thing. My patrons are, of course, great, and as thanks for helping support the channel, they get early access to videos, behind the scenes looks, bonus game design goodness that I selfishly hoard away from the public, and even some extra special shoutouts in the credits, both in text form off to the side, and also a voiced shoutout for those in the top tier, who are Ali Wright, Andrew Labrano, Asaran, Ano94, Brennan Spalding, Brian Notariani, Buy More Skyrim for Todd, Constantine Amend, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjes, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Digleteer, Dis Ellie, Ecton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Spaceborn, Eugene Bulkin, Gazkull, Iofur93, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Konulov, Luke Kokoran, Macewinder54, Marika Vladilena Altair, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-like Substance, congratulations on the new longest name, Meme Dragon, Mika Oi, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasek, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Ray's Dad, Silver Forfey, Steam Rollerman, Steve Riley, Ty Guren, Tyler Duncan, Uprising, Von Boomslang, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and ciao. Okay, that's all from me. See you around, buckaroos. Yeehaw. Bye.